The sound of a shower running, a door being forced open, hushed voices in panic. 3 gunshots that would forever alter the lives of everyone involved. September 7th, 2021, in Columbus, Georgia, began like any other day, but before dawn broke, it would claim the life of a promising musical artist, leave another man fighting for his freedom, and place a pregnant woman at the center of a deadly love triangle. What drives someone to cross that invisible line from heated passion to deadly violence? The story of Maurice Lil Nuke Jackson, Quincy Wade, and Chana Powell isn't just another headline. It's a haunting reminder of how quickly unresolved emotions can escalate beyond control. Have you ever witnessed jealousy transform someone you know? Have you seen the warning signs of possessiveness but dismissed them as mere passion? Perhaps you've felt that uncomfortable tension when relationships overlap and boundaries blur. When love and betrayal collide, they create a perfect storm that can sweep away rational thought in seconds. This case exposes the dangerous reality that occurs when interpersonal conflicts are left to fester until they explode. What happened in that apartment wasn't random, it wasn't unpredictable, and most importantly, it wasn't unavoidable. By examining the events leading to this tragedy, we uncover crucial lessons that could save lives, perhaps even yours or someone you care about. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe now. These stories aren't just about crime, they're about recognizing the warning signals that precede violence and understanding how to intervene before it's too late. Every subscription helps spread awareness that might prevent another tragedy like the one we're about to explore. Before they became entangled in this fatal triangle, each person involved had their own story, their own aspirations, their own humanity. Maurice Vaughn Jackson, known professionally as Lil Nuke, was building momentum as a rising voice in Columbus's hip-hop scene. His tracks, Pay Attention, Manipulate, and Real Me, weren't just songs, they were raw expressions of his reality, resonating with listeners who saw their own struggles reflected in his lyrics. Beyond music, Maurice had begun exploring acting, suggesting a creative spirit unwilling to be confined to a single medium. Friends described him as vibrant, determined, and fiercely loyal, qualities that would ultimately place him in harm's way on that fateful September night. His mother, Cleopatra Vaughn, had watched with pride as her son transformed his experiences into art. She couldn't have known she would soon become the voice demanding justice after his silencing. In the tight-knit Columbus community, Maurice wasn't just another aspiring artist. He was a symbol of possibility, someone who might break through and put their city on the map. Then there was Quincy Wade. At 26, Wade's life had become increasingly defined by inner turmoil and relationship conflict. Friends described a man who could be charming and generous one moment, consumed by jealousy the next. His relationship with Chana Powell had recently collapsed under the weight of accusations and suspicion. The impending birth of a child whose paternity he fiercely claimed but others disputed, had heightened tensions to a breaking point. At the center of this volatile dynamic stood Chana Powell, a woman whose personal choices had placed her in an impossible position. Recently separated from Wade and newly involved with Maurice, she found herself navigating the dangerous waters between two men with a connection that neither fully understood nor accepted. Her pregnancy added another layer of complexity, transforming what might have been a typical breakup into something far more consequential. These 3 lives, previously moving on separate trajectories, converged with catastrophic results when personal boundaries were violated and confrontation replaced communication. The apartment at Paternity Place became the stage for their final, tragic interaction, a space where emotions ran too hot and exits seemed non-existent. None of them woke up that morning expecting the day to end in death and criminal charges. None anticipated becoming statistics in Columbus's mounting homicide count. None foresaw that their personal disputes would soon be dissected in courtrooms and news reports. 3 ordinary people, 1 deadly encounter. A community left to make sense of how relationship dynamics could deteriorate so completely that reconciliation became impossible and violence became inevitable. Relationships rarely collapse in an instant. Instead, they deteriorate through a series of escalating conflicts, unaddressed grievances, and missed opportunities for resolution. The connection between Chana Powell and Quincy Wade followed this tragic pattern, with each confrontation more volatile than the last. What began as passionate attachment had transformed into something more dangerous. Friends noticed the shift, how Wade's affection increasingly manifested as control, how disagreements that once ended in compromise now concluded with threats. The relationship was bleeding out slowly, but neither participant fully recognized the gravity of the situation until it was too late. The pregnancy should have been a moment of joy. Instead, it became another battleground. Wade insisted the child was his, but doubts had been cast. What should have been a private matter became a public point of contention, with accusations flying between parties and mutual friends forced to take sides. As Powell began spending time with Maurice Jackson, the situation deteriorated further. What might have been a clean break became complicated by proximity. Columbus isn't a vast metropolis where former couples can easily avoid each other. In this compressed social environment, news traveled quickly, and Wade soon learned of Powell's new relationship with the local artist. Have you ever witnessed someone unable to accept that a relationship has ended? That dangerous period where one person has moved forward while the other remains fixated on what was lost. This case exemplifies how critical that transition period can be, especially when proper boundaries aren't established or respected. The warning signs were flashing red in the weeks before the shooting. Wade appeared unannounced at places where he knew Powell would be. Communication shifted from reconciliation attempts to unveiled hostility. Mutual friends reported that Wade had made statements about not letting her go and handling the situation. Phrases that seem ominous in retrospect, but weren't taken seriously enough in the moment. Powell sought refuge with Maurice, believing distance would diffuse the situation. Maurice, perhaps underestimating the volatility of the circumstances, offered protection without recognizing he was being drawn into a conflict with potentially deadly stakes. Neither anticipated that Wade's sense of betrayal would override reason, leading him to that final, irrevocable decision to enter the apartment uninvited. This deterioration demonstrates how relationship conflicts, when accompanied by jealousy, perceived betrayal, and unresolved paternity disputes, can create a perfect storm of emotional volatility. The tragedy wasn't that these people experienced conflict, it's that they lacked the tools and perspective to resolve it before it escalated beyond the point of no return. The events that unfolded at Patriot Place Apartments in the early hours of September 7th began with a decision. Quincy Wade, fueled by emotions that had been building for weeks, chose to enter an apartment where he knew Chana Powell was staying with Maurice Jackson. This wasn't a chance encounter or a misunderstanding, it was a deliberate action that set in motion irreversible consequences. The clock had barely passed midnight when Wade approached the apartment. Finding the patio door unlocked, he entered uninvited, a fact that would later become crucial in the legal proceedings. Inside, Powell and Jackson were unprepared for the confrontation that was about to unfold. What happened next occurred in a matter of minutes, but the repercussions would echo through years. According to testimonies later presented in court, Powell had been trying to avoid a confrontation with Wade for days. She had chosen to stay with Maurice, believing distance might calm the situation. Instead, it had only intensified Wade's determination to confront her about their relationship and the unborn child she was carrying. The apartment offered few places to retreat. When Wade entered, Powell sought refuge in the bathroom, a small space that would soon become the stage for the deadly encounter. Jackson had been showering, unaware that Wade had entered the apartment until Powell's panicked reaction alerted him. Wade approached the bathroom door, reportedly with a firearm already drawn. The confined space amplified the tension as he confronted Powell, allegedly making threats regarding both her life and the unborn child. It was a moment where emotions completely overtook reason, a point of no return where years of built-up resentment crystallized into immediate danger. Maurice Jackson, emerging from the shower, intervened in what appeared to be an attempt to protect Powell. What happened next occurred in a chaotic blur of motion and sound. Both men were armed. Multiple shots were fired in rapid succession. When the echoes faded, Jackson lay fatally wounded with a gunshot to the chest. Wade had sustained injuries to his legs, but remained conscious. Powell, trapped in this nightmare scenario, witnessed the entire exchange, a trauma that would stay with her long after the physical danger had passed. Neighbors, awakened by the gunfire, called emergency services. The police response was swift, but for Maurice Jackson, it came too late. Wade fled the scene despite his injuries, later receiving treatment at a hospital in La Grange. This departure would later be interpreted in conflicting ways, as evidence of guilt by the prosecution, as a desperate act of self-preservation by the defense. The aftermath was immediate and chaotic. Emergency responders pronounced Jackson dead at the scene. The apartment, once an ordinary living space, was transformed into a crime scene, with investigators documenting every detail, collecting shell casings, photographing blood patterns, and beginning the meticulous process of reconstructing those fatal minutes. For Columbus residents, this incident represented more than just another crime statistic. It marked the 50th homicide in a community already grappling with violence. Each death prior had gradually numbed the public consciousness, but the loss of a local artist with growing recognition cut through that numbness, forcing many to confront the reality of how quickly conflicts can turn deadly. This confrontation exemplifies how quickly situations can escalate when emotions override judgment, when previous boundaries are violated, and when firearms introduce lethal potential into already volatile circumstances. The decisions made in those few minutes would permanently alter the trajectory of multiple lives, ending one promising future, putting another in legal jeopardy, and leaving a third forever marked by witnessing violence at its most personal. The tragedy lies not just in what happened, but in how preventable it was. How many opportunities existed to de-escalate before that final, fatal moment? The investigation began the moment first responders secured the scene at Patriot Place Apartments. Columbus Police Department detectives worked methodically, piecing together the sequence of events through physical evidence and witness statements. This wasn't a whodunit. The central players were immediately clear. The question was whether Wade's actions constituted murder or self-defense. Every element of the scene told part of the story. The position of shell casings indicated where shots were fired from. Blood patterns helped reconstruct movement during the confrontation. The unlocked patio door confirmed how Wade gained entry. These physical details would later become crucial puzzle pieces in the courtroom narrative. Chana Powell's testimony proved central to the investigation. As the only witness who observed the entire confrontation, her account provided context that physical evidence alone couldn't convey. She described Wade's uninvited entry, the threats made, and the sequence of the shooting, details that formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. The investigation revealed that both men were armed, complicating the narrative. Jackson had legally possessed his firearm, while questions about Wade's weapon would become a point of contention in court. Ballistics confirmed that the fatal shot came from Wade's gun, but the defense would later argue this didn't preclude a self-defense scenario. By late September 2021, investigators had gathered sufficient evidence for the district attorney to bring formal charges against Quincy Wade: malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, and home invasion. These charges reflected the prosecution's view that Wade initiated the conflict and escalated it to deadly violence. The legal proceedings moved at the deliberate pace characteristic of the justice system. For nearly 2 years, pre-trial motions, evidence hearings, and procedural matters occupied the court calendar. Throughout this period, Jackson's family, particularly his mother Cleopatra Vaughn, attended every hearing, determined to see justice for their lost son. When the trial finally commenced in September 2023, the courtroom became an arena where competing narratives sought to explain those fatal minutes. The prosecution portrayed Wade as an aggressor who, driven by jealousy and possessiveness, invaded a home and initiated deadly violence. They emphasized the unlawful entry, the threats made to Powell, and Wade's decision to bring a firearm to the confrontation. The defense team built their case around self-defense, arguing that Wade feared for his life when confronted by an armed Jackson. They highlighted inconsistencies in witness statements and suggested that Wade's entry, while unauthorized, wasn't intended to result in violence, but rather in a conversation about the unborn child. Testimony from the medical examiner detailed the path of the bullet that ended Jackson's life. Technical information that somehow made the human loss more stark. Police officers recounted arriving at the chaotic scene, A driver who initially claimed to have transported an injured Wade later admitted to fabricating portions of his statement, introducing further complexity to the already tangled narrative. Throughout the proceedings, the three central figures emerged in greater detail. Jackson, portrayed as a promising artist and protective friend. Wade, depicted alternately as a calculated aggressor or a man caught in a desperate situation. And Powell, whose relationships with both men had created the conditions for tragedy. The jury was tasked with an unenviable responsibility, determining whether Wade's actions constituted murder or self-defense, a determination that hinged on interpretations of intent, reasonable fear, and proportional response. The legal standards for these concepts would guide their deliberations through a case saturated with emotional complexity. After days of testimony and evidence presentation, the case moved to the jury. They deliberated on charges that could have resulted in a life sentence for Quincy Wade. When they returned with their verdict, it reflected the complexity of the case rather than providing clean resolution. Wade was acquitted of the most serious charges: malice, murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, and home invasion. The jury found him guilty of criminal trespassing, a misdemeanor, acknowledging his unauthorized entry into the apartment but rejecting the prosecution's narrative about intentional malicious violence. This split verdict sent shockwaves through the Columbus community. For Jackson's family, particularly his mother who had attended every day of the trial, the outcome felt like a second loss, a judicial decision that seemed to diminish the value of their loved one's life. Outside the courthouse, supporters gathered around Cleopatra Vaughn, whose grief now mingled with profound disappointment in a system she believed had failed her son. For those who knew Powell, the verdict evoked mixed reactions. Some saw it as appropriate, given the complexities of the confrontation and the presence of weapons on both sides. Others viewed it as an insufficient response to a preventable tragedy, triggered by Wade's decision to enter the apartment uninvited and armed. The case became a flashpoint for broader discussions about self-defense laws, domestic conflicts, and how the justice system addresses cases where personal relationships complicate clear categorization of victim and aggressor. Legal experts noted that the verdict highlighted the challenge jurors face when evaluating self-defense claims. How immediate danger is perceived in highly emotional situations creates reasonable doubt that benefits defendant. Local musicians organized memorial performances honoring Jackson's artistic contributions, ensuring his creative legacy would endure beyond the headlines about his death. These events transformed grief into celebration of his talent, while raising awareness about conflict resolution and violence prevention. For Columbus, already struggling with elevated homicide rates, the case underscored the reality that many violent incidents stem not from random crime, but from personal disputes that escalate beyond control. Community organizations responded by expanding programs focused on conflict mediation, particularly among young adults, hoping to prevent similar tragedies. The outcome also prompted complicated conversations about accountability. Wade avoided a lengthy prison sentence, but faced the social consequences of his actions. A community divided in its perception of his responsibility, relationships fractured beyond repair, and the internal burden of knowing his presence that night directly contributed to a death. This case, like many that involve personal relationships gone tragically wrong, offered no catharsis through its legal resolution. Instead, it left a community grappling with questions about justice, responsibility, and how to prevent anger from turning deadly in future conflicts. This tragedy wasn't a sudden explosion, but rather a slow-burning fuse that could have been extinguished at multiple points before reaching its deadly conclusion. Recognizing similar warning signs might prevent future violence in volatile relationships. The first red flag appeared in the possessive language and behavior Wade exhibited toward Powell after their relationship ended. When someone refuses to accept a breakup, treating the former partner as property rather than an autonomous individual, the potential for escalation increases dramatically. This sense of entitlement, the belief that one has the right to control another's choices, often precedes violence. A second warning sign emerged in the dispute over the unborn child. While conflicts regarding paternity and parental rights are common, they become dangerous when used as justification for confrontation rather than addressed through appropriate legal channels. When someone bypasses courts and mediation in favor of direct confrontation, they signal an unwillingness to accept boundaries essential for peaceful resolution. Perhaps the most concerning indicator was Wade's pattern of appearing uninvited in spaces where Powell was present. This boundary violation demonstrated a willingness to disregard consent and personal space, a precursor to the fatal home invasion. Each uninvited appearance represented an opportunity for intervention that never came. These situations highlight how crucial support networks are during relationship transitions. Friends and family who notice escalating tensions can create safety buffers, encourage legal intervention through restraining orders when appropriate, and help vulnerable parties establish secure living arrangements away from potential aggressors. Communication strategies also play a vital role in diffusing volatile situations. When direct contact becomes dangerous, having neutral third parties facilitate necessary interactions reduces the risk of emotional escalation. Professional mediators, particularly those specializing in high-conflict separations, can manage conversations about shared concerns like children while maintaining essential boundaries. For those experiencing similar situations, resources exist that weren't fully utilized in this case. Domestic violence organizations offer safety planning assistance, structured approaches to minimizing risk during relationship transitions. Legal aid services provide guidance on obtaining protective orders. Counseling specifically designed for separation helps process emotions constructively rather than destructively. The presence of firearms dramatically elevated the stakes in this confrontation. When relationships deteriorate, temporary separation from weapons can prevent momentary anger from resulting in permanent consequences. This case demonstrates how quickly accessibility to deadly force can transform a confrontation from threatening to fatal. Most importantly, this tragedy teaches us to take threats seriously, both as potential victims and as community members who might intervene. What others dismiss as just talk or venting often reveals genuine intentions. When someone threatens harm, believing them the first time may prevent becoming a statistic. The lessons from this case aren't about assigning blame posthumously, but about recognizing patterns that precede violence. By understanding these indicators, we gain the power to interrupt similar trajectories before they reach their devastating conclusion. No momentary conflict justifies the permanent loss of life, yet without intervention, heated emotions can easily overwhelm rational judgment. If you've recognized these warning signs in your own relationships, or those of people close to you, share your experiences in the comments. Your insight might help others identify dangerous situations before they escalate beyond control. Beyond the circumstances of his death, Lil Nuke Jackson left behind a creative legacy that continues to resonate throughout Columbus and beyond. His music, raw, authentic expressions of his experiences, lives on through streaming platforms where new listeners discover his work daily, extending his voice beyond his physical existence. Friends describe Jackson as someone determined to build a career on his own terms, refusing to compromise his artistic vision despite the challenges facing independent musicians. This determination manifested in tracks that tackled difficult subjects with unflinching honesty, creating connections with listeners who recognized their own struggles in his lyrics. His mother, Cleopatra Vaughn, transformed her grief into advocacy, establishing a foundation in Maurice's name focused on conflict resolution among young adults. Through this organization, she arranges workshops in local schools and community centers, teaching strategies for de-escalating confrontations before they turn violent. These efforts ensure that Maurice's impact extends beyond his music, potentially saving lives through education. The annual memorial concert organized in his honor has grown from a small gathering of friends into a significant community event that showcases emerging Columbus artists. This platform helps launch careers while keeping Maurice's memory alive, creating opportunities he would have championed had his life not been cut short. Perhaps most poignantly, several tracks Maurice recorded but never released have been completed by collaborators who worked closely with him. These posthumous releases provide glimpses of the artistic evolution now forever incomplete, directions his creativity might have explored had circumstances been different. Local recording studios have established scholarships in Maurice's name, providing studio time to promising artists who lack financial resources. These opportunities directly address barriers Maurice himself faced, creating pathways for voices that might otherwise remain unheard. The true measure of Maurice Jackson's legacy lies not just in what he accomplished during his brief career, but in how his story continues to inspire both creative expression and conscious choices about conflict resolution. Through music that survives him and lessons drawn from his loss, his influence persists, a reminder that while life can end in an instant, impact endures through those who carry forward both memories and messages. 3 lives converged in a bathroom in Columbus, Georgia. A rising musician, his friend seeking safety, and a former partner unable to accept the relationship's end. Their collision resulted in 1 life extinguished, another forever altered by legal consequences, and a third burdened with witnessing a moment no one should experience. This triangle of tragedy exemplifies how quickly personal disputes can escalate beyond the point where reconciliation remains possible. The story of Maurice Jackson, Chana Powell, and Quincy Wade contains universal elements that transcend their specific circumstances. We recognize the passion that transforms into possessiveness, the misguided belief that conflict resolves through confrontation rather than communication, and the fatal introduction of firearms into emotionally charged situations. These elements appear repeatedly in cases across every community, creating predictable patterns with preventable outcomes. What makes this case particularly compelling isn't its uniqueness, but its representativeness, how it illustrates dangers present in countless relationships where boundaries blur and emotions override judgment. The warning signs that preceded this tragedy appear regularly in relationships around us, often dismissed until crisis renders them impossible to ignore. Columbus faced its 50th homicide of 2021 that September morning, a statistic that risks reducing Maurice Jackson to a number rather than a person with dreams, talent, and connections. His death represents more than another entry in crime statistics. It embodies the human cost when conflict resolution fails and emotion overpowers reason. The mixed verdict delivered by the jury reflects our collective ambivalence about assigning blame in such complicated human entanglements. It acknowledges that truth rarely falls neatly into categories of complete guilt or innocence, especially when relationships create contexts where multiple parties make decisions that collectively lead toward tragedy. While we cannot rewrite the events of September 7, 2021, we can extract wisdom from them. We can recognize warning signs earlier, intervene more effectively, and establish boundaries more firmly. We can acknowledge that separation often represents the most dangerous period in troubled relationships and provide appropriate support during these transitions. Most importantly, we can remember that behind every crime statistic stand real people whose lives matter, whose potentials, once extinguished, represent incalculable loss. Maurice Jackson's music continues playing, but the artist himself will create no more. The tragedy lies not just in what happened, but in all that never will. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to ensure these crucial narratives reach those who need them most. Share this video with someone who might benefit from recognizing warning signs in relationships around them. Your engagement helps transform these tragedies from mere sensationalism into lessons that might prevent future violence. In remembering Maurice Jackson, in understanding the circumstances of his death, we honor him not just as a victim, but as a talented individual whose story deserves to be told, and whose fate might help others avoid similar endings to their own stories.